Hey, this is Tadukoo. I'm going to talk about the history of Tadukoo Util and Tadukoo Engine and the related projects to them. Util and Engine are the main personal programming projects I've worked on for the past several years. On October 12th, 2019, I started working on 1000 blank white cards online for the first time since I started my full time programming job in August 2019. So, only a couple months. Here it's abbreviated as KBWCO instead of writing out 1000 blank white cards online. Just a quick explanation of that. Thousand Blank White Cards is a game you can play in real life where basically you and the people you're playing with create the cards during the game. Though you would also reuse cards from previous games. Those cards can literally do anything you want, so the game's ultimately about creativity. I've worked on a computer version of it on and off for a while, and this was the latest time I went back to it. So this time around, I had a greater focus on writing more reusable code at this point, basically with the idea to write code that could be used in multiple projects. While I was already doing this at work and college, I hadn't been in my personal programming projects before this point, and essentially started from scratch in each project. On October 13th, I added multimap to the KBWCO client. It was basically a hash map that stored values in lists with methods to hide away the list logic. The idea was that it would be useful for certain things in 1000 blank white cards online. Then on October 26th, 2019, I added many-to-many map to the KBWCO client. There's a database used in KBWCO for storing all the data necessary, so it made some sense to have a many-to-many map, but I'm not sure I had an actual use for it at the time. While I am showing the KBWCO client here, I want to note that it won't stick around for all diagrams, and that other pieces not relevant won't stick around either. Some of these times I'll call out that it's going away, but others it'll just disappear. In the past, I had been attempting to extract an API and engine from an old game project, but that hadn't been progressing well because of attempting to keep the game working properly while extracting those components out. On November 10th, 2019, I decided that with KBWCO, I also had the issue of the utilities being held back by having it inside the game and trying to keep the game working, and decided to split the utility code into a separate project called Tadukoo Util. When this change was made, it was made so that KBWCO would use Tadukoo Util rather than containing it. So this diagram, the arrow is showing a dependency, where KBWCO client depends on Tadukoo Util. This means essentially that Tadukoo Util is required for KBWCO client to work. Dependencies will be shown this way moving forward. On this day, I also combined other utility-based ideas into Tadukoo Util. There was a commit titled Annotations, Processors, and Exceptions, oh my. Annotations was referring to some annotations made in KBWCO that were moved over that I was using to mark certain utility code in that project, similar to deprecation but more specific. I had also written some utilities for dealing with annotations that were moved over, which included an annotation processor annotation to automatically register annotation processors, and there was an exception util method to get a stack trace string. This is also when file util and string util were first added, and the multi-map and many-to-many map were made into interfaces with hash map implementations of them instead. On December 24th, 2019, Tadukoo Util was finally made into a Maven project. Work uses Maven as its build system, and it makes it easier to handle dependencies and build settings compared to not using it. At this point, I also combined other utilities into Tadukoo Util. I had some database code that ultimately came from a college project that became the Tadukoo database module. I had modified this code a bit to be more general due to working on certain things at work before it ended up in Util. I also had written code in KBWCO for custom file formats, and that became more general and became Tadukoo file format. At this point, I prefer using JSON over this, but Tadukoo file format is similar to YML files, and was likely influenced by using YML files back in Bucket when I had made some Bucket plugins in the past. In this diagram, Tadukoo Util is now being shown as both a module and a project. Each module, in this case Tadukoo Util, Tadukoo file format, and Tadukoo database, will become a jar file when compiled and made available, but they're all under one project called Tadukoo Util. Also here, I've started showing the version as alpha version 0.1 snapshot. The snapshot part is saying it's not at a release yet, and alpha is just saying it's an early version of it. I tend to refer to projects as alpha in early stages, beta when they're getting closer to a release, and considered fully released at version 1.0 when the main originally planned features are completed. On December 21st, 2019, I had started working on Tadukoo genealogy. I had used an old version of Family Tree Maker in the past, and it no longer worked on the latest Windows versions, and there were certain features I felt it lacked anyway compared to what I wanted to do with it. The idea with Tadukoo genealogy was it would be a free genealogy program that allows for plugins for people to be able to add features they wanted to it. December 30th, 2019 was the first commit of Tadukoo genealogy, and at this point it only had a simple start of an API and some code to generate a Word document for some genealogy information. Tadukoo genealogy had been made as a new program to use Tadukoo Util, instead of having to update KBWCO to work with the changes to Util. On February 9th, 2020, events were brought into Tadukoo Util from KBWCO, and custom view components were also brought over and made into the Tadukoo View module. On February 29th, 2020, Tadukoo Genealogy added the Genealogy Program module, which relied on the Tadukoo View module. Some of the View module involved code for displaying frames and switching between them as an early sort of engine, so this commit in Genealogy referred to the Util project as Tadukoo Util / Tadukoo Engine. This then is the first reference of Tadukoo Engine, even though it doesn't refer to the same thing as it does now. On March 28th, 2020, I finally made the switch in my personal programming to use IntelliJ instead of Eclipse. IntelliJ is the objectively better IDE to write Java code in, but it'd still be a while before I made the switch at work because so much was set up in Eclipse that I had to move over. This was also the point where Tadukoo Lang and Tadukoo Annotation Processor were split out of the Tadukoo Util module. The idea was that Tadukoo Lang would contain the most basic utilities like Boolean Util and File Util, and Annotation Processor would contain annotation-related utilities. Tadukoo Util as a module, then, would be basic utilities still, but less basic than the Lang module, things like multi-map and many-to-many map. On May 3rd, I started a series of blog posts that I called my Tadukoo Look and Feel Journey. Around this time, I realized that I didn't need to make custom components like buttons and text input fields like I had in Tadukoo View, and can instead use the default Java components and customize them using a custom look and feel. The look and feel basically defines a theme for the components to follow, and my idea was to make one with more customizations than the existing Java look and feels provide, and allow you to easily create your own themes then in my look and feel. On May 24th, 2020, Tadukoo Look and Feel was moved into the Tadukoo Util project, and Tadukoo View was removed from Tadukoo Util to be placed in an old Tadukoo Util project and renamed to Old Tadukoo View. The move of Look and Feel into this project happened after the 6th blog post in my series. This is also when I started using the MIT license for my Tadukoo Util project to allow others to more freely use it as they desire. June 13th, 2020 is the earliest point there's evidence of Tadukoo Engine / launcher existing. Tadukoo Genealogy had a commit this day where the program module points to Tadukoo Engine instead of Tadukoo View, but the engine doesn't yet have a repository published. On the genealogy commit I wrote, Tadukoo Engine / launcher is early in development as a means to be a launcher for various programs I, and in the future others, make. Basically, the Tadukoo Engine / launcher would include Tadukoo Util and allow for general programs such as this to act more like plugins of the engine, so that ideally there's only one copy of the Tadukoo Util jars on a person's computer to provide common functionality across the various programs that use it. On June 14th, Tadukoo Engine had its first commit, where the engine and launcher modules were included. At the time, the engine depended on Tadukoo Lang, and there weren't really other dependencies involved besides launcher depending on engine. This is also the day that Maven Central information appears in the Tadukoo Util POM file, even though I wasn't deploying there quite yet. Also with the engine, I decided it needed a logo, and the only logo I had lying around for it was the KBWCO logo, which is still used currently. On June 16th, the installer module was added to Tadukoo Engine, and the launcher was now depending on look and feel for view theme purposes. The installer exists to be able to create an installer exe for the launcher to install on Windows. The idea would be to do this for Mac and Linux in the future too, but the engine hasn't had a real release yet anyway. On June 20th, 2020, the Tadukoo Downloader module was added to the engine project, and so a pre-alpha 0.0.1 version of the engine was made as a release on GitHub. The downloader basically downloads the installer by grabbing it from GitHub and then runs it. The idea would be that the downloader would download the proper installer based on your operating system and run it, and then the downloader could be distributed instead of distributing the installers. At this time, the installer is also depending on Tadukoo file format. This is meant as a temporary thing because of Tadukoo Genealogy being put on the engine, since at this stage there wasn't a way to specify other libraries, only to specify programs and provide libraries that the installer directly depends on. On this day, the Tadukoo Parsing and Tadukoo Web Services projects were also created with empty Tadukoo JSON and Tadukoo REST modules. You'll notice the arrows on them point directly between projects instead of between modules like the other arrows have been. Basically, each project in Maven has a parent POM file to specify dependencies and other information for the project as a whole, in addition to POM files within each module for module-specific settings. So in this case, the Parsing and Web Services parent POM files are referencing Tadukoo Util's project as dependencies, but the modules aren't actually using any specific Tadukoo Util modules yet. On July 4th, 2020, I took some of the more general code from the old Tadukoo View module and used it to create a new Tadukoo View module in Tadukoo Util. At this point, it's only a few really basic utility classes that don't do much, but the idea is that it would include extensions of the default Java components that allow for extra customization to be used in the Tadukoo look and feel in the future. On August 14th, I wrote a blog post called The Tadukooverse Master Plan, which was a basic plan to get Tadukoo Util and Tadukoo Engine to release version 1.0. The idea is that Tadukoo Util, Tadukoo Parsing, Tadukoo Web Services, and Tadukoo GitHub would all need to be completed to a certain point as needed by Tadukoo Engine, and then Tadukoo Engine could be released. One thing of note here is that Tadukoo GitHub doesn't exist at this point, or if it does, I haven't published it on GitHub yet. At this point, Tadukoo Parsing's purpose was for JSON parsing. Tadukoo Web Services' purpose was to provide utilities for interacting with REST APIs online. And Tadukoo GitHub existed to make some GitHub REST API calls that use JSON in order to get files from releases to download for use in the engine/launcher. I also noted at this time that all these projects would release as version 1.0 at the same time. The idea behind this was that the main purpose of all the projects was to get Tadukoo Engine to its 1.0 release, and so they would be done when they're ready for that. I think now I would disagree and think that, for example, GitHub should probably support more API calls to GitHub's API than what the engine would require before being considered 1.0, and that the other projects should likely have more features as well. For Tadukoo Util, I was more specific and listed 5 versions to be released for it. Alpha version 0.1 would be the completion of the Tadukoo annotation processor, Tadukoo Lang, and Tadukoo Util modules. Alpha version 0.2 would be the completion of the Tadukoo look and feel module. Alpha version 0.3 would be the completion of the Tadukoo view module. Alpha version 0.4 would be the completion of the Tadukoo database module. And then beta version 0.5 would be the completion of the Tadukoo file format. I also noted that I had no further plans at the time for Tadukoo Util, and so beta version 0.5 might just become release version 1.0 eventually. On September 2nd, I made an update to the master plan post. I said that parsing web services and GitHub no longer had to reach version 1.0 by the time Engine reaches version 1.0. I also noted that Tadukoo Util was close to alpha version 0.1 at this point, and I was questioning Maven Central deployment due to the weirdness of some of the modules not being completed in alpha version 0.1. On September 5th, 2020, Tadukoo Util alpha version 0.1 was released. I still labeled the jars with snapshot in the GitHub release, since I didn't consider a bunch of them to be complete yet, and I didn't publish them to Maven Central. I also specifically listed in the release that for the other modules this was an unofficial release. At this time, I also noted in the master plan that Tadukoo Parsing only needs to reach alpha version 0.1 with JSON support for the engine's release. In this diagram, I've colored Tadukoo Util's project to be green. This is to signify that it's at a released state here. In future diagrams, if a project is at a release, it will be green, and if it had a previous release but is in a new snapshot state, it'll be yellow. On September 25th, 2020, Tadukoo Look and Feel started depending on Tadukoo View, and Tadukoo View now depends on Tadukoo Lang. Tadukoo Fonts was made on October 2nd, 2020, with a release on the 3rd. On the 4th, support for it was included in Tadukoo View. Basically, it's a collection of free-to-use fonts that can be used in the libraries or programs that use Tadukoo Util or Engine. On October 6th, support for these fonts would be available in Tadukoo Look and Feel for themes as well. Fonts will not be shown in the other diagrams because it hasn't changed and isn't really code. On October 9th, the master plan was updated to say Tadukoo Util Alpha version 0.2 would be for Tadukoo View's completion instead of Tadukoo Look and Feel. The reasoning for this was that Look and Feel now depends on View, so View would make more sense to complete first. On November 7th, there was a snapshot release of Tadukoo Util, and the master plan was updated to say Tadukoo Parsing Alpha version 0.1 would be the next release. At this point, the engine module also now depends on Tadukoo Util instead of Tadukoo Lang. On November 8th, Tadukoo JSON was completed in Tadukoo Parsing, but was not released quite yet. On November 10th, 2020, Tadukoo Util Alpha version 0.2 and Tadukoo Parsing Alpha version 0.1 were released. At this point, web services and GitHub were the next planned pieces to work on. Tadukoo Installer technically did still depend on Tadukoo file format at this point, but is not displayed here for simplicity since it was intended as a temporary thing. It wouldn't be until December 17th, 2020 that the dependency would actually be removed. These releases were the first time the code was actually deployed to Maven Central for others to make use of. On December 12th, 2020, Tadukoo Util Alpha version 0.2.1 was released, which included a bunch of fixes and improvements, and was also when I switched from Java 14 to 15. I had started out using Java 14 thinking it was a long-term support release, and the installer was using preview features for it. So the idea was to upgrade up to Java 17, the next long-term support release, as they were available. December 12th was also when Tadukoo Java first appeared as a module in Tadukoo Parsing. Tadukoo Java is a module used for generating Java code, which at the time was used for generating simple Java Pojo classes, and in the future would be for parsing Java code into Pojos as well to more easily modify it. Pojo stands for plain old Java object and refers to simple Java classes that just have fields with get and set methods. On December 13th, 2020, there was a major split with Tadukoo Util, and 5 projects were released due to the split as Alpha version 0.2.2. The Tadukoo Util module had functional interfaces for throwing functions in it that got split out into Tadukoo functions, and then Tadukoo Lang, Tadukoo functions, and Tadukoo Util were the modules left inside the Tadukoo Util project. The Tadukoo database module was renamed to Tadukoo MySQL, since it's code specifically for a MySQL database, and moved into a new project called Tadukoo Database. Annotation-related code was moved to a new project called Tadukoo Annotations, and the annotation processor logic was separated from the basic annotations provided into 2 separate modules. Tadukoo file format was moved to Tadukoo Parsing, since it's parsing a relatively simple file format, and parsing was bumped up to version 0.2.2 since file format was moved there, rather than have file format moved back to a version 0.1.1 or 0.2 instead. Tadukoo View and Tadukoo Look and Feel were both considered View-related modules and moved to a new Tadukoo View project. With this move, Tadukoo View was also split up into Tadukoo View, which contains the most basic View utilities, Tadukoo Components, which contains custom components, and Tadukoo Form, which allows you to create forms easily, including using the custom components. The form logic had been added to Tadukoo View originally back on November 1st. Basically, the form is a more advanced Pojo. You put form fields into it, which are basically fields with display information. So you could make a string form field as a text input or a Boolean form field as a checkbox. There would be get and set methods for the field values that display in the form. The idea behind the split was caused by the changing of the idea behind Tadukoo Util. Up until this point, the idea was that Tadukoo Util would be a collection of utilities to be used in various projects, but now it was redefined to be the most basic utilities. So the modules moved out of util are more specialized for specific purposes, whereas util is more general purpose now. On December 16th, an update was made to the master plan discussing the alpha version 0.2.2 releases. Basically, Tadukoo Util was planned to have another release for more added to Tadukoo functions, and then the Tadukoo Engine would likely use most of the split libraries after the split had happened. On December 19th, 2020, Tadukoo Util had its alpha version 0.3 release with those changes to Tadukoo functions mentioned. I want to note that Tadukoo annotations and Tadukoo database are no longer displayed here. The reason for that is that they don't actually have any real changes here for a while after this, and both had been removed from the master plan at some point. On January 17th, 2021, Tadukoo View had its alpha version 0.3 release. This release added further customization options for buttons and labels used in View. On February 6, 2021, Tadukoo Util had its alpha version 0.3.1 release, along with Tadukoo View's alpha version 0.3.1 release, Tadukoo Parsing's alpha version 0.2.3 release, and Tadukoo Web Services and Tadukoo GitHub both having their first release as alpha version 0.1. Tadukoo Util added more utilities around text manipulation here. Tadukoo View had minor changes in its update to use the new util version. One of those minor changes was that I realized I didn't need every module to use Tadukoo Util, since they already get it by using Tadukoo View. Tadukoo Parsing had minor changes and made a new module, Tadukoo Parsing, which is meant for basic parsing utilities to be shared across Parsing's modules. At this point, it had extracted some of the logic from JSON into it. That's why JSON depends on it now. Tadukoo REST was considered completed at this point, as it provides what's needed to use GitHub's REST endpoints at this time. Tadukoo GitHub has completed the Git releases endpoints logic at this time for what was needed for the engine/launcher. On April 17th, Tadukoo Util had its alpha version 0.4 release, which involved adding dictionaries and updating to Java 16. On April 24th, Tadukoo Parsing had its alpha version 0.3 release, which involved the completion of Tadukoo file format and updating to Java 16. On April 25th, 2021, Tadukoo View had its alpha version 0.3.2 release, and Tadukoo Web Services and Tadukoo GitHub had their alpha version 0.1.1 releases. These releases were mostly to update to Java 16 and the latest util/parsing libraries. On May 27th, Tadukoo Maven was started. The point of Tadukoo Maven is to provide Maven base palms and archetypes to use for projects. Base palms would allow defining common dependencies here instead of defining them in every single project, things like Java version and Maven settings. Archetypes would exist to be able to create new projects easier that make use of these base palms. On May 28, 2021, Tadukoo Maven had its alpha version 0.1 release, which introduced Tadukoo Maven base palm to use as the base palm file for all projects, and also Tadukoo Maven library palm to use for projects using Tadukoo Util. At this point, only Tadukoo Util, Tadukoo Parsing, and Tadukoo View made use of Maven, since it was in an early stage. I've chosen to depict Tadukoo Maven in blue in these diagrams to distinguish it from the proper code projects displayed. Also note that since the base palms are used by the parent palms, no modules point to Maven, and instead the projects point to their respective parent palms. On May 29th, 2021, Tadukoo Maven Alpha version 0.2 was released. This saw the addition of the parsing POM, web services POM, and view POM, which got used by some of the other projects. The view POM is essentially there for engine at this point, but isn't actually being used by the engine yet. On July 5th, Tadukoo Util Beta version 0.5, Tadukoo JUnit Alpha version 0.1, and Tadukoo Maven Alpha version 0.3 were released. Util had byte util added along with updating file util and mapped pojo along with other changes. Tadukoo JUnit was a new project to provide basic utilities to use in unit testing of code, and Tadukoo Maven was updated to include information from Tadukoo JUnit as dependencies in its base POMs. On July 10th, Tadukoo Parsing Alpha version 0.3.1, Tadukoo Web Services, and Tadukoo GitHub Alpha version 0.1.2, and Tadukoo Code Parsing Alpha version 0.3.1 were released. Tadukoo Parsing moved its Java module out into the new Tadukoo Code Parsing project, and they each had minor changes, and then Web Services and GitHub were basically updated to the newer parsing and util versions. The reason for splitting Java out of parsing was the idea that parsing would be for parsing simple formats, while Java code is not a simple format to be parsed and deserves its own project. The idea at this point with naming it code parsing was that perhaps some of the logic could be shared across parsing other programming languages. On July 15th, 2021, Tadukoo View had its alpha version 0.3.3 release, which was mostly minor changes, including updating to the latest util version. On November 19th, 2021, everything that had a previous release had a new minor release that was basically to update to Java 17. The one notable new thing is that Tadukoo Maven had a Tadukoo Maven program POM added to it for programs made using the engine to use as their base POM to provide engine dependencies. It was likely used at this time by programs I had in early stages, but it's hard to note most program progress because a lot of it remains uncommitted to GitHub and considered to be early progress. On December 12th, 2021, Tadukoo Database had its alpha version 0.3 release, which was considered the completion of Tadukoo MySQL. On January 8th, 2022, Tadukoo Combos was started as a project. Its single module is Tadukoo Ultimate Pojo. The idea here is that it's a combination of form, database Pojo, and JSON ordered class. Each of these is Pojos that hold field values, but the form provides logic for displaying the fields in a form. Database Pojo provides logic for retrieving and storing the fields in a database, and JSON ordered class can be used to save or load the fields from a JSON file. On January 9th, Tadukoo JUnit was moved into Tadukoo Util. The JUnit module will no longer appear in feature diagrams because it's simpler to exclude it and it's just used for testing and not for regular code. On May 27th, 2022, the Tadukoo Web Parsing project was started. At this point, the module was called Tadukoo Web Parsing as well, but it got renamed to Tadukoo HTML on May 29th. The idea here was to be able to parse and generate HTML code, and then later CSS and Markdown, to be able to do stuff with web pages. The idea behind this project was related to generating pages used on the GitHub pages about the projects and releases. Tadukoo Web Parsing and Tadukoo Combos haven't had releases since, as the focus was shifted back to focusing on util and engine and their related projects. For this reason, they won't be shown on the remaining diagrams. On February 3rd, 2023, Tadukoo View was split into 3 projects. The View and Components modules were kept in the base View project as the more basic View-related utilities. Tadukoo Form was moved to its own project and split into multiple modules. Basically, Tadukoo Form Fields is the basic form fields such as Boolean and string. Tadukoo Form is for actual forms, which there are several versions of it for use with tabbed views or for using it as a main view, etc. And Tadukoo Form Components is used for form fields that are made of forms. The primary example of this is a date form field, which is made as a form containing a month dropdown, a numeric day picker, and a numeric year picker. Tadukoo Look and Feel also became its own project at this point. You'll notice for this diagram I flipped what's on each side so that the view projects are on the left and the parsing projects are on the right. To me, this feels like the more correct positioning of the projects in a diagram, but I'm probably just biased based on how I drew a recent diagram on a whiteboard at home. On March 25th, 2023, Tadukoo Maven had its alpha version 0.4 and alpha version 0.4.1 releases. Alpha version 0.4 saw the addition of the JUnit form and engine base POMs. JUnit POM is basically the Maven base POM, but also including the JUnit dependency, intended for projects that want to use that dependency but not the rest of Tadukoo Util. Form POM exists for the purpose of projects making use of Tadukoo Form, and then Engine Base POM is extending it to also provide look and feel and GitHub dependencies. Alpha version 0.4.1 had to be released because I already pushed alpha version 0.4 before finding and fixing incorrect information for the form project in the form POM. On March 26th, I had started thinking of making a new project called Ultimate Power. It ultimately wasn't started until around April 9th, but then hasn't been pushed to GitHub yet, so it isn't displayed in this diagram. There's an existing Java library called Lombok that provides some annotations that will generate some basic boilerplate Java code in classes that use them. The main example I think of is that it has annotations to generate get and set methods in Pojos. So if you have a Pojo with 50 fields, it saves you from typing out those 100 methods to have a get and set method for each field. So I wondered, is it possible to make annotations that generate more complicated Java code? For example, give it the information for my JSON fields and generate a JSON class Pojo for me, or do something similar with the former database Pojo? The answer is no. Lombok only provides specific annotations. You can't make custom ones. So then the question was, can I make my own custom ones? I learned that Java's default annotation system doesn't allow this, and Lombok basically inserts itself into Eclipse's compiler and does similar stuff with IntelliJ and Maven too. But I figured out how I could make a Maven plugin to handle custom annotations of my own, and at least part of how Lombok works with IntelliJ to handle code hinting and not error read for methods that don't exist because the annotations generate them. So the idea with Ultimate Power is you'd be able to create your own annotations to generate common code as needed. I'll probably explain it in more detail in its own video at some point with examples. But in order to be able to make Ultimate Power, there has to be Java parsing and code generation, which I could do with the Tadukoo Java module I had been working on in the past. Because of this, I started focusing on Tadukoo Java again. The idea with Ultimate Power is that most of my projects would be able to use it, so I wanted it to sit high on the hierarchy of projects. It would have to sit under Java for sure, since it needs that, but with Java being in code parsing under parsing, making custom annotations with JSON wouldn't be possible. So Tadukoo Java moved to depend on only Tadukoo Util's project instead, and the project got renamed from Tadukoo Code Parsing to Tadukoo Java. So on April 15th, 2023, Tadukoo Java Alpha version 0.4 was released. It didn't contain Java parsing at this time yet, and it really should have been released using a release of util instead of relying on a util snapshot as it does here. But it did have a lot of the necessary code generation logic at this time. On August 31st, 2023, Tadukoo Maven Alpha version 0.4.2 and Tadukoo Util Beta version 0.6 were released. Tadukoo Maven added the plugin POM for use in projects with Maven plugins, this being Ultimate Power, which isn't displayed yet, along with updating some dependencies and moving some more settings into the base POM. Tadukoo Util had various changes. This was the first release with Tadukoo JUnit in it, and it added parallel utilities. On August 30th, 2024, Tadukoo Maven Beta version 0.5 and Tadukoo Util Beta version 0.6.1 were released. Tadukoo Maven renamed every base POM to no longer have Maven in the name, and added an archetype for each base POM to be able to generate a basic project using each base POM. It also removed plugin POM and engine base POM. Plugin POM is covered by the base POM now, and engine base is removed in favor of the engine using form POM, and then just specifying the look and feel and GitHub dependencies itself. Library POM is now for projects to use Ultimate Power instead of projects using util. Util POM and Java POM were created for projects that use util and Java respectively. So util POM is used by Tadukoo Java and Java POM is used by Ultimate Power, which is still not displayed here yet. Tadukoo Util was updated to use the base POM for Maven Beta version 0.5 and have the util module dependent on functions so that other modules can just depend on util and get all three modules, lag functions and util. On November 26, 2024, Tadukoo Java had its beta version 0.5 release. This release introduced Java parsing to the project and also included minor updates to the existing code pojos. At this point, I'm finally depicting Ultimate Power in this diagram, and you can see the various snapshots of the projects now depend ultimately on Ultimate Power instead of util directly. Also, projects using util now only have to point to the util module instead of also depending on functions directly. The Ultimate Power annotation processor comes from the old Tadukoo annotations, so this is effectively Tadukoo annotations coming back, but in a different form. It does contain the annotation utilities that were in that old project. Because of stemming from annotations, since annotations had an alpha version 0.2.2 release, Ultimate Power's first release will be alpha version 0.3. On December 18th, 2024, Tadukoo Maven had its beta version 0.5.1 release. This release updated a bunch of dependencies in the base POMs, mostly on Maven plugins. On January 9th, 2025, Tadukoo Maven had its beta version 0.5.2 release. This release was an update to the Maven plugin settings used by Ultimate Power in the base POM. The next planned release is to release Tadukoo Util Beta version 0.7 and Tadukoo Java Beta version 0.6 together. For Tadukoo Java, the plan is to handle Java types and variable arguments better, along with handling of static code blocks. For Tadukoo Util, some string utilities were moved over from Tadukoo Java, along with adding non-throwing functional interfaces and making throwing streams. I'm planning to make another video talking more about future plans past these releases, so I'm done now with this video, which is mainly about the history of the projects. So, bye for now.